Hi, I'm Jason from Nightly Reads, where I read stories to you in hopes to help you settle down at the end of a long day or just to help you fall asleep. Tonight, we're going to be starting a new book by Jules Verne called Journey to the Center of the Earth. It's personally one of my favorites. On this in this book, we will be following Professor Otto Lindebrock, his nephew Axel, and their guide Hans as they journey to the center of the earth. Today is day one of reading this book, so there's nothing to summarize. So we're just going to go and hop right in to chapter one. So let's go ahead and get started. Chapter 1. My uncle makes a great discovery. Looking back at all that has occurred to me since that eventful day, I am scarcely able to believe in the reality of my adventures. They were truly so wonderful that even now I am bewildered when I think of them. My uncle was a German, having married my mother's sister, an Englishwoman. Being very much attached to his fatherless nephew, he invited me to study under him in his home in the fatherland. This home was in a large town, and my uncle, a professor of philosophy, chemistry, geology, mineralogy, and many other ologies. One day, after passing some hours in the laboratory, my uncle being absent at the time, I suddenly felt the necessity of renovating the tissues. I I was hungry and was about to rouse our old French cook when my uncle, Professor von Hardwig, suddenly opened up the street door and came rushing upstairs. Now, Professor Hardwig, my worthy uncle, is by no means the bad sort of man. He is, however, choleric and original. To bear with him means to obey, and scarcely had his heavy feet resounded with our joint domicile that he shouted for me to attend upon him. Harry, Harry, Harry. I hastened to obey. But before I could reach his room, jumping 3 stairs at a time, he was stamping his right foot upon the landing. Harry, he cried in a frantic tone, are you coming up? Now, to tell the truth, at the moment I was far more interested in the question as to what was to constitute our dinner than in any problem of science. To me, soup was more interesting than soda, an omelette more tempting than arithmetic, and an artichoke of 10 times more value than any amount of asbestos. But my uncle was not a man to be kept waiting, so adjourning therefore all minor questions, I presented myself before him. He was a very learned man. Now most of his persons in this category supply themselves with information, as peddlers do with goods, for the benefit of others, and lay upon stores in order to diffuse them abroad for the benefit of society in general. Not so my excellent uncle, Professor Hardwig. He studied, he consumed the midnight oil. He pored over heavy tomes, and digested huge quartos and folios in order to keep the knowledge he acquired to himself. There was a reason, and it may be regarded as a good one, why my uncle objected to displaying his learning more than absolutely necessary. He stammered, and when intent upon explaining the phenomena of the heavens, was apt to find himself at fault, and allude in such a vague way to sun, moon, and stars that few were able to comprehend his meaning. And to tell the honest truth, when the right word would not come, it generally was replaced by a very powerful adjective. In connection with the sciences, there are many almost unpronounceable names, names very much resembling those of Welsh villages, and my uncle being very fond of using them, his habit of stammering was not thereby improved. In fact, there were periods in his discourse when he would finally give up and swallow his discomfiture in a glass of water. As I said, my uncle, Professor Hardwig, was a very learned man, and I now add at almost kind relative. I was bound to him by the double ties of affection and interest. I took deep interest in all his doings, and hoped some day to be almost as learned as himself. It was a rare thing for me to be absent from his lectures. Like him, I preferred mineralogy to all the other sciences. My anxiety was to gain real knowledge of the earth. Geology and mineralogy were to us the sole objects of life, and in connection with these studies, many fair specimen of stone, chalk, or metal did we break with our hammers. Steel rods, lodestones, glass pipes, bottles of various acids were often before us than our meals. My uncle Hardwig was once known to classify 600 different geological specimens by their weight, hardness, fusibility, sound, taste, and smell. He corresponded with all the great learned and scientific men of the age. I was therefore in constant communication at all events of the letters of Sir Humphrey Davy, Captain Franklin, and other great men. But before I state the subject on which my uncle wished me to confer, I must say a word about his personal appearance. Alas, my readers will see a very different portrait of him in the future, after he has gone through the fearful adventures yet to be related. My uncle was 50 years old, tall, thin, and wiry. Large spectacles hid, to a certain extent, his vast, round, and goggle eyes, while his nose was irreverently compared to a thin file. So much so did it resemble one that a compass was said to point in his direction. The truth being told, however, the only article really attracted to my uncle's nose was tobacco. Another peculiarity of his was he always stepped a yard at a time, clenched his fist as if they were going to hit you, and was, in one of his particular humors, very far from a pleasant companion. It is further necessary to observe that he lived in a very nice house, in that very nice street at Hamburg. Though lying in the center of a town, it was perfectly rural in all its aspect. Half wood, half bricks, with old-fashioned gables, and one of the few old houses spared by the Great Fire of 1842. When I say a nice house, I mean handsome, old, tottering, and not exactly comfortable to English notions. A house a little off the perpendicular and inclined to fall into the neighboring canal. Exactly the house for a wandering artist to depict. All the more that you could scarcely see for ivy and a magnificent old tree which grew over the door. My uncle was rich. His house, his own property, while he had considerable private income. To my notion, the best part of his possession was his goddaughter, Gretchen, and the old cook. The young lady, the professor, and I were sole inhabitants. I loved mineralogy. I loved geology. To me, there was nothing like pebbles. And if my uncle had been in a little less of a fury, we should have been the happiest of families. To prove the excellent Hardwig's impatience, I solemnly declare that when the flowers in the drawing-room pots began to grow, he rose every morning at 4 o'clock to make them grow quicker by pulling on the leaves. Having described my uncle, I will now give an account of our interview. He received me in his study, a perfect museum, containing every natural curiosity that can well be imagined, minerals, however, predominating. Every one was familiar to me, having been catalogued by my own hand. My uncle, apparently oblivious to the fact that he had summoned me to his presence, was absorbed in a book. He was particularly fond of early editions, tall copies, and unique works. Wonderful! he cried, tapping his forehead. Wonderful! Wonderful! It was one of those yellow-leaved volumes now rarely found on stalls, and to me it appeared to possess but little value. My uncle, however, was in its raptures. He admired its binding, the clearness of its characters, the ease at which it opened in his hand, and repeated aloud in a half-dozen times that it was very, very old. To my fancy, he was making a great fuss about nothing. But it was not my province to tell him so. On the contrary, I professed considerable interest in the subject and asked him what it was about. It is the Heims Kringla of Snorre Tarlson, he said, the celebrated Icelandic author of the 12th century. And it is true and correct. It is a true and correct account of the Norwegian princes who reigned in Iceland. My next question related to the language in which it was written. I hoped at all events it was translated into German. My uncle was indignant at the very thought, and declared he wouldn't give a penny for a translation. His delight was to have found the original work in the Icelandic tongue, which he declared to be one of the most magnificent yet simple idioms in the world, while at the same time its grammatical combinations were the most varied known to its students. About as easy as German, was my insidious remark. My uncle shrugged his shoulders. The letters, at all events, I said, are rare, difficult of comparison. It's a runic manuscript, the language of the original population of Iceland, invented by Odin himself, cried my uncle, angry at my ignorance. I was about to venture upon some misplaced joke on the subject when a small scrap of parchment fell out of the leaves. Like a hungry man snatching at a morsel of bread, the professor seized it. It was about 5 inches by 3 and scrawled over in the most extraordinary fashion. The lines shown here were an exact facsimile of what was written on the vulnerable piece of parchment, and have wonderful importance, as they induced my uncle to undertake the most wonderful series of adventures which ever fell into the lot of human beings. My uncle looked keenly at the document for some moments, and then declared it was runic. The letters were similar to those in the book, but what did they mean? This was exactly what I wanted to know. Now, as I had a strong conviction that the runic alphabet and dialect were simply an invention to mystify poor human nature, I was delighted to find that my uncle knew as much about the matter as I did, which was nothing. At all events, the tremulous motion of his fingers made me think so. And yet, he muttered to himself, it is an old Icelandic, I am sure of it. And my uncle ought to have known, for he was a perfect polyglot dictionary in himself. He did not pretend, like certain learned pundit, to speak the 2,000 languages and 4,000 idioms made use in different parts of the globe, but he did know all the more important ones. It was a great doubt to me now to what violent measures my uncle's impetuosity might have led him. Had not the clock struck 2, and our old French cook called out to let us know that dinner was on the table. Bother the dinner, cried my uncle. But as I was hungry, I sallied forth to the dining room, where I took upon my usual quarters. Out of politeness, I waited 3 minutes, but no sign of my uncle, the professor. I was surprised. He was not usually so blind to the pleasure of a good dinner. It was the acme of German luxury, parsley soup, a ham omelette with sorrel trimmings, an oyster of veal stew with prunes, delicious fruit, and sparkling moselle. For the sake of poring over this musty old piece of parchment, my uncle forbore to share our meal. To satisfy my conscience, I ate for both. The old cook and housekeeper was nearly out of her mind. After taking so much trouble to find her master not appear at dinner was to her a sad disappointment, which, as she occasionally watched the havoc I was making on the viands, became also alarm. If my uncle were to come to the table after all. Suddenly, I had consumed the last apple and drunk the last glass of wine. A terrible voice was heard with no great distance. It was my uncle roaring for me to come to him. I made very nearly one leap of it, so loud, so fierce was his tone. And that concludes chapter 1. Let me get a drink, if I can find it. Which I cannot, so I guess we're going to continue on to chapter 2. Chapter 2. The Mysterious Parchment. I declare, cried my uncle, striking the table fiercely with his fist, I declare to you this is runic, and it contains some wonderful secret, which I must get at any price. I was about to reply when he stopped me. Sit down, he said, quite fiercely, and write down my dictation. Naturally, I obeyed. I will substitute, he said, a letter of our alphabet for that of the runic. We will then see what it will produce. Now begin and make no mistakes. The dictation commenced with the following incomprehensible result. Trust me when I say it's incomprehensible. Scarcely giving me time to finish, my uncle snatched the document from my hands and examined it with the most rapt and deep attention. I should like to know what it means, he said after a long period. I certainly could not tell him, nor did he expect me to, his conversation being uniformly answered by himself. I declare it puts me in mind of a cryptograph, he cried. Unless indeed the letters have been written without any real meaning. And yet why take so much trouble? Who knows but I may be on the verge of some great discovery? My candid opinion was that it was all rubbish. But this opinion I kept carefully to myself, and my uncle's choler was not pleasant to bear. All this time he was comparing the book with the parchment. The manuscript volume and the smaller document are written in different hands, he said. The cryptograph is of much later date than the book. There is an undoubted proof of the correctness of my surmise. The first letter is a double M, which was only added to the Icelandic language in the 12th century. This makes the parchment 200 years posterior to the volume. The circumstances appeared very probable and very logical, but it was all a surprise to me. To me, it appeared probable that this sentence was written by some owner of the book. Now, who was the owner? Is the next important question. Perhaps, by great luck, it may be written somewhere in the volume. With these words, Professor Hardwigg took off his spectacles and, taking a powerful magnifying glass, examined the book carefully. On the fly-leaf was what appeared to be a blot of ink, but on examination proved to be a line of writing almost effaced by time. This is what he sought, and after some considerable time he made out the letters. Arne Saknasem, he said in a joyous and triumphant tone. That is not only an Icelandic name, but of a learned professor of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist. I bowed as a sign of respect. These alchemists, he continued, Avicenna, Bacon, Lully, Paracelsus, were all true, the only learned men of the day. They made surprising discoveries. May not this Saknussemm, nephew mine, have hidden on this bit of parchment some astounding invention? I believe the cryptograph to have a profound meaning, which I must make out. My uncle walked about the room in a state of excitement almost impossible to describe. It may be so, sir, I timidly observed, but why conceal it from posterity? If it be a useful, worthy discovery. Why, how should I know? Did not Galileo make a secret of his discoveries in connection with Saturn? But we shall see. Until I discover the meaning of this sentence, I will neither eat nor sleep. My dear uncle, I began. Nor you neither, he added. It was lucky I had taken double allowance that day. In the first place, he continued, there must be a clue to the meaning. If we could find that, the rest would be easy enough. I began seriously to reflect. The prospect of going without food and sleep was not a promising one. So I determined to do my best to solve the mystery. My uncle, meanwhile, went on with his soliloquy. The way to discover it is easy enough. In this document, there are 132 letters, giving 79 consonants to 53 vowels. This is about the proportion found in most southern languages, the idioms of the north being much more rich in consonants. We may confidently predict, therefore, that we have to deal with a southern dialect. Nothing could be more logical. Now, said Professor Hardwick, to trace the particular language, as Shakespeare says, that is the question, was my rather satirical reply. This man, Saknussemm, he continued, was a very learned man. Now, as he did not write in the language of his birthplace, he probably, like most learned men of the 16th century, wrote in Latin. If, however, I prove wrong in this guess, we must try Spanish, French, Italian, German, Greek, and even Hebrew. My own opinion, though, is decidedly in favor of Latin. This proposition startled me. Latin was my favorite study, and it seemed sacrilege to believe this gibberish to belong to the country of Virgil. Barbarous Latin, in all probability, continued my uncle, but still Latin. Very probably, I replied, not to contradict him. Let us see into the matter, continued my uncle. Here you see we have a series of 132 letters apparently thrown pell-mell upon paper, without method or organization. They're words which are composed wholly of consonants, such as RNLLS, others which are nearly all vowels. The fifth, for instance, which is UNTIEEF, and one of the last, OSEIBO. This appears an extraordinary combination. Probably we shall find that the phrase is arranged according to some mathematical plan. No doubt a certain sentence has been written out and then jumbled upon. Some plan to which some figure is the clue. Now, Harry, to show your English wit, what is that figure? I could give him no hint. My thoughts were indeed far away. While he was speaking, I had caught sight of the portrait of my cousin Gretchen, and was wondering when she would return. We were engaged, and loved one another very sincerely. But my uncle, who never thought of even such sublunary manners, knew nothing of this. Without noticing my abstraction, the professor began reading the puzzling cryptograph all sorts of ways, according to some theory of his own. Presently rousing my wandering attention, he dictated one precious attempt to me. I mildly handed it over to him. It read as follows. Still gibberish. I could scarcely keep from laughing, while my uncle, on the contrary, got into a towering passion, struck the table with his fist, darted out of the room, out of the house, and then, taking his heels, was presently lost to sight. Chapter 3. An Astounding Discovery. "What is the matter?" cried the cook, entering the room. "When will master have his dinner?" "Never." "And his supper?" "I don't know. He says he'll eat no more. Neither shall I." My uncle has determined to fast and make me fast until he makes out this abominable inscription, I replied. "You will be starved to death," she said. I was very much of the same opinion, but not liking to say so, I sent her away, and began my usual sort of classification. But try as I might, nothing could keep me from thinking alternatively of the stupid manuscript and of the pretty Gretchen. Several times I thought of going out, but my uncle would have been angry at my absence. At the end of the hour, my allotted task was done. How to pass the time? I began by lighting my pipe. Like all other students, I delighted in tobacco. And seating myself in the great armchair, I began to think. Where was my uncle? I could easily imagine him tearing along some solitary road, gesticulating, talking to himself, cutting the air with his cane, and still thinking of the absurd bit of hieroglyphics. Would he hit upon some clue? Would he come home in better humor? While these thoughts were passing through my brain, I mechanically took up the execrable puzzle and tried every imaginable way of grouping the letters. I put them together by twos, by threes, by fours, and by fives. In vain. Nothing intelligible came out, except that the 14th and 15th and 16th made ice in English, and the 84th, 85th, and 86th made the word sir. And at last I seemed to find the Latin words rota, mutable, era, neck, and atra. Huh, there seems to be some truth in what my uncle's thinking, thought I. And then again I seemed to find the word luco, which means sacred wood. And in the third line I appeared to make out la beled, a perfect Hebrew word. And at the last of the syllables, mer, are mer, which are French. It was enough to drive one mad. 4 different idioms in this absurd phrase? What connection could there be between ice, sir, anger, cruel, sacred word, changing, mother, R, and C? In the first and the last might, in the sentence connected with Iceland, mean sea of ice? But what of the rest of this monstrous cryptograph? I was in fact fighting against an insurmountable difficulty. My brain was almost on fire. My eyes were strained with staring at the parchment. The whole absurd collection of letters appeared to dance before my vision in a number of black little groups. My mind was possessed with temporary hallucination. I was stifling. I wanted air. Mechanically, I fanned myself with the document, of which I now saw the back and then the front. Imagine my surprise when, glancing at the back of the wearisome puzzle, the ink having gone through, I nearly made out Latin words, and among the others, caritum and terrestre. I had discovered the secret. It came upon me like a flash of lightning. I had got the clue. All you had to do to understand the document was to read it backwards. All the ingenious ideas of the professor were realized. He had dictated it rightly to me, and by mere accident I had discovered what he so much desired. My delight, my emotion may be imagined. My eyes were dazzled, and I trembled so that at first I could make nothing of it. One look, however, would tell me all I wish to know. Let me read, I said to myself after drawing a long breath. I spread it before me on the table. I passed my finger over each letter and spelled it through. In my excitement, I read it out. What horror and stupefaction took the possession of my soul. I was like a man who had received a knockdown blow. Was it possible I had really read the terrible secret and had really been accomplished? A man had dared to do what? No living being should ever know. Never, I cried, jumping up. Never shall my uncle be made aware of the dread secret. He would be quite capable of undertaking that terrible journey. Nothing would check him, nothing stop him. Worse, he would compel me to accompany him, and we should be lost forever. But no, such folly and madness cannot be allowed. I was almost beside myself with rage and fury. My worthy uncle is already nearly mad, I cried aloud. This would finish him. By some accident he may make the discovery, in which case we are both lost. Perish the fearful secret. Let the flames forever bury it in oblivion. I snatched up the book and the parchment and was about to cast them into the fire when the door opened and my uncle entered. I had scarcely time to put down the wretched documents before my uncle was by my side. He was profoundly absorbed. His thoughts were evidently bent on the terrible parchment. Some new combination had probably struck him while taking his walk. He seated in his armchair and with a pen began to make an algebraical calculation. I watched him with anxious eyes. My flesh crawled as it became probable he would discover the secret. His combinations, I knew now, were useless. I haven't discovered the only one clue. For 3 mortal hours he continued without speaking a word, without raising his head, scratching, rewriting, calculating, over and over again. I knew that in time he must hit upon the right phrase. The letters of every alphabet have only a certain number of combinations, but then years might elapse before he would arrive at the correct solution. Still, time went on. Night came, the sounds in the streets ceased, and my uncle went on, not even answering our worthy cook when she called us to supper. I did not dare to leave him, so waved her away, and at last fell asleep on the sofa. When I awoke, my uncle was still at work. His red eyes, his pallid countenance, his matted hair, his feverish hands, and his hectically flushed cheeks showed how terrible had been his struggle with the impossible, and what fearful fatigue had undergone during the long sleepless night. It made me quite ill to look at him. Though he was rather severe with me, I loved him, and my heart ached at his suffering. He was so overcome by the one ideal that he could not even get in a passion. All his energies were focused on one point, and I knew that by speaking one little word, all the suffering would cease, but I could not speak it. My heart was, nevertheless, inclining toward him. Why, then, did I remain silent? In the interest of my uncle himself, nothing shall make me speak, I muttered. He will want to follow in the footsteps of the other. I know him well. His imagination is a perfect volcano, and to make discoveries in the interests of geology, he would sacrifice his life. I will therefore be silent and strictly keep the secret I have discovered. To reveal it would be suicidal. He would not only rush himself into destruction, but drag me with him. I crossed my arms, looked the other way, and smoked, resolved never to speak. When our cook wanted to go to the market or on any other errand, she found the front door was locked and the key was taken away. Was this done purposefully or not? Surely Professor Hardwigg did not intend the old woman and myself to become martyrs to his obstinate will. Were we to be starved to death? A frightful recollection came to mind. Once we had fed on bits and scraps for a week while he sorted some curiosities. It gave me a cramp just to think of it. I wanted my breakfast. I saw no way of getting it. Still, my resolution held good. I would starve rather than yield. But the cook began to take me seriously to task. What was to be done? She could not go out, and I dared not. My uncle continued counting and writing. His imagination seemed to have translated him to the skies. He neither thought of eating nor drinking. In this way 12 o'clock came around. I was hungry, and there was nothing in the house. The cook had eaten the last bit of bread. This could not go on. I did it, however, until 2, when my sensations were terrible. After all, I began to think the document very absurd. Perhaps it might only be a gigantic hoax. Besides, some means would surely be found to keep my uncle back from attempting any such absurd expedition. On the other hand, if he did attempt anything so crazy, I should not be compelled to accompany him. Another line of reasoning partially decided me. Very likely he would make the discovery himself when I should have suffered starving for nothing. Under the influence of hunger, this reasoning appeared admirable. I determined to tell him. The question now rose how to do it. I was still dwelling on the thought when he rose and put on his hat. What, go out and lock us in? Never. Uncle, I began. He did not appear to even hear me. Professor Hardwigg, I cried. What? He retorted. Did you speak? How about the key? What key? The key of the door? No, no of these horrible hieroglyphics. He looked at me from under his spectacles and stared at the odd expression of my face. Rushing forward, he clutched me on my arm and keenly examined my countenance. His very look was an interrogation. I simply nodded. With the incredulous shrug of the shoulders, he turned up on his heel. Undoubtedly, he thought I had gone mad. I've made a very important discovery. His eyes flashed with excitement. His hand was lifted in a menacing attitude. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was hard to say which was most excited. You don't mean to say that you have any idea of the meaning of the scroll? I do, was my desperate reply. Look at the sentence as dictated by you. Well, but it means nothing, was the angry answer. Nothing if you read it from left to right. But Mark, if from right to left, backwards? Cried my uncle in wild amazement. Oh, most cunning Saknussemm, and I to be such a blockhead. He snatched up the document, glazed at it with a haggard eye, and read it out as I had done. It read as follows. The dictation is in Latin. However, after being translated, it reads as follows. Descend into the crater of Yakul of Sneffels, which the shade of Scatartis caresses before the kalends of July, audacious traveler, and you will reach the center of the earth. I did it. My uncle leaped 3 feet from the ground with joy. He looked radiant and handsome. He rushed about the room, wild and delight, full of satisfaction. He knocked over tables and chairs. He threw his books about until at last Utterly exhausted, he fell to his armchair. "What's the o'clock?" he asked. "About 3. "My dinner does not seem to have done me much good," he observed. "Let me have something to eat. We can then start at once. Get my suitcase ready." "What for?" "And your own," he continued. "We start at once." My horror may be conceived. I resolved, however, to show no fear. Scientific reasons were the only ones likely to influence my uncle. Now there were many against this terrible journey. The very idea of going down to the center of the earth was simply absurd. I determined, therefore, to argue the point after dinner. My uncle's rage was now directed against the cook for having no dinner ready. My explanation, however, satisfied him, and having gotten the key, she soon contrived to get sufficient supply to satisfy our voracious appetites. During the repast, my uncle was rather gay than otherwise. He made some of those peculiar jokes which belong exclusively to the learned. He called me to the study, which took a chair on opposite sides of the table. "Henry," he said, in a soft and winning voice, "I have always believed you ingenious, and you have rendered me a service never to be forgotten. Without you, this great and wondrous discovery would never have been made. It is my duty, therefore, to insist on you sharing the glory." He is in good humor, thought I. I'll soon let him know the opinion of glory. "In the first place," he continued, "you must keep the whole affair a profound secret. There is no more envious race of men than scientific discoveries. Many would start on the same journey. At all events, we will be the first in the field." "I doubt your having many competitors," was my reply. "A man of real scientific acquirements would be delighted for the chance. We should find a perfect stream of pilgrims on the traces of Arcne Saknussemm, if this document were once made public." "But, my dear sir, is not this paper very likely to be a hoax?" "The book in which we find it is sufficient proof of its authenticity," he replied. "I thoroughly allow that the celebrated professor wrote the lines, but only, I believe, as a kind of mystification," was my answer. Scarcely were the words out of my mouth when I was sorry I had uttered them. My uncle looked at me with a dark and gloomy scowl, and I began to be alarmed for the results of our conversations. His mood soon changed, however, and a smile took the place of a frown. "We shall see," he remarked with his decisive emphasis. "But see, that is what is all of this about yokel, and the snuffles, and this Scartarius. I have never heard anything about them." "The very point to which I am coming. I lately received from my friend Augustus Peterman, of Lutzbeg, a map. Take down the third atlas from the second shelf, Series Z, Plate 4. I rose, went to the shelf, and presently returned with the volume indicated. "This," said my uncle, "is one of the best maps of Iceland. I believe it'll settle all of your doubts, difficulties, and objections." With a grim hope to the contrary, I stooped over the map. And that concludes Chapter 3. So we'll continue on to Chapter 4. Chapter 4. We start on the journey. "You see, the whole island is comprised of volcanoes," said the professor, "and remark carefully that they all bear the name of Jökull. The word is Icelandic, and it means a glacier. In the most In most of the lofty mountains in that region, the volcanic eruptions come forth from ice-bound caverns, hence the name applied to every volcano in this extraordinary island. But what does the word snuffles mean? To this question I expected no rational answer. I was mistaken. Follow my finger to the western coast of Iceland, where you see Reykjavik, its capital. Its capital. Follow the direction of one of its innumerable fjords or arms of the sea, and what do you see below the 65th degree of latitude? A peninsula, very like the thigh bone in shape. And in the center of it, a mountain. Well, that's Sneffels. I had nothing to say. That is Sneffels, a mountain about 5,000 feet in height, one of the most remarkable in the whole island, and certainly doomed to be the most celebrated in the world. For through its crater we shall reach the center of the earth. Impossible! Cried I, startled and shocked at the thought. Why impossible? Said Professor Hardwigg in his severest tones. Because its crater is choked by lava, by burning rocks, by infinite dangers. But if it be extinct? That would make a difference. Of course it would. There are about 300 volcanoes in the whole surface of the globe, but the greater number are extinct. Of these, Sneffels is one. No eruption has occurred since 1219. In fact, it has ceased to become a volcano at all. After this, what more could I say? Yes, I thought of another objection. But what is all of this about Scartaris and the Kalends of July? My uncle reflected deeply. Presently, he gave forth the result of his reflections in a stupendous tone. What appears obscure to you, to me, is light. This very phrase shows how particular Saknussemm is in his directions. The Sneffels mountain has many craters. He is careful, therefore, to point to the exact one which is the highway into the interior of the earth. He lets us know for this purpose that about the end of the month of June, the shadow of Mount Scartaris falls upon the one crater. There can be no doubt about the matter. My uncle has an answer for everything. I accept your explanations, I said, and Saknussemm is right. He found out the entrance to the bowels of the earth, and he has indicated correctly. But that he or anyone else ever followed up with the discovery is madness to suppose. Why so, young man? All scientific teaching, theoretical and practical, shows it to be impossible. I cared nothing for theories, retorted my uncle. But it is not well known that is it not well known that heat increases 1 degree for every 70 feet you descend into the earth? Which gives a fine idea of central heat. All the matters which compose the globe are in a state of incandescence. Even gold, platinum, and the hardest rocks are in a state of fusion. What would become of us? Don't be alarmed at the heat, my boy. How so? Neither you nor anybody else know anything about the real state of the Earth's interior. All modern experiments tend to explode the other theories. Were any such heat to exist, the upper crust of the Earth would be shattered into atoms, and the world would be at an end. A long, learned, and not uninteresting discussion followed. which ended in this wise: I do not believe in the dangers and the difficulties for which you, Henry, seem to multiply. And the only way to learn is like Arne Saknussemm, and to go and see. Well, I cried, overcome at last, let us go and see. Though how we can do so in that dark is another mystery. Fear nothing, we shall overcome these and many other difficulties besides. As we approach the center, I expect we find it luminous. Nothing is impossible. And now that we have come to a thorough understanding, not a word to any living soul. Our success depends on secrecy and dispatch. Thus ended our memorable conference, which roused a perfect fever in me. Leaving my uncle, I went forth like one of the possessed. Reaching the banks of the Elbe, I began to think. Was all I had heard really and truly possible? Was my uncle in his sober senses, and could the interior of the earth be reached? Was I the victim of a madman, or was he a discoverer of rare courage and grandeur of conception? To a certain extent, I was anxious to be off. I was afraid of my enthusiasm would cool. I determined to pack up at once, and at the end of an hour, however, on my way home, I found my feelings had very much changed. I am all abroad, I cried. 'Tis a nightmare. I must have dreamed it. At this moment I came face to face with Gretchen, who I warmly embraced. So you have come to meet me, she said. How good of you. But what is the matter? Well, it was no use mincing the matter. I told her all. She listened with awe, and for some minutes she could not speak. Well, I had said, rather anxiously, what a magnificent journey! If I were only a man, a journey worthy of the nephew of Professor Hardwigg, I should look upon it as an honor to accompany him. My dear Gretchen, I thought you would be the first to cry out against this mad enterprise. No, on the contrary, I glory in it. It is magnificent, splendid, an idea worthy of my father, Henry Lawson. I envy you. This was it. It is conclusive, the final blow of all. When we entered the house, we found my uncle surrounded by workmen and porters, who were packing up. He was pulling and hauling at a bell. Where have you been wasting your time? Your suitcase is not packed, my papers are not in order, and the precious tailor has not brought my clothes, nor my gaiters. The key of my carpet bag is gone. I looked at him stupefied, and still he tugged away at the bell. We are really off then, I said. Yes, of course. And yet you go out for a stroll, unfortunate boy. And when do we go? The day after tomorrow, at daybreak. I heard no more, but darted off to my little bedchamber and locked myself in. There was no doubt about it now. My uncle had been hard at work all the afternoon. The garden was full of ropes, rope ladders, torches, gourds, iron clamps, crowbars, alpenstocks, and pickaxes. Enough to load 10 men. I passed a terrible night. I was called early the next day to learn that the resolution of my uncle was unchanged and irrevocable. I also found my cousin and fiancée as warm on the subject as was her father. The next day, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the porte-chaise was at the door. Gretchen and the old cook received the keys of the house, and scarcely pausing to wish anyone goodbye, we started on our adventurous journey into the center of the earth. So we're going to go ahead and call it quits there for the night. I thank you for joining, and I hope to see you next time. Remember, if you liked this, hit the heart at the bottom of the video to show me that I'm doing a good job. And if you want to see the next video or listen to the next audio, be sure to ring the bell, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Good night.